Looking ahead, challenges and opportunities in the changing world. Welcome to Talking Economics, a podcast by the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute. Why do some regions prosper while others lag behind in terms of economic development? Today we will talk about regional economics, from historical roots to contemporary challenges, with Christian Ochsner, assistant professor at CERGE-EI and research associate at the University of St. Gallen. Christian joined CERGE-EI in 2018. He holds a doctoral degree from the Dresden University of Technology. In his research, he looks at critical junctures in history and how they matter today. Welcome, Christian.
Welcome, and thanks for being here.
Well, we'll start with a very broad question. What is regional economics? Can you tell us more about what it means?
Yeah, so it's like always in economics, it's the interplay probably between two variables. So one is the regional dimension. You can think about space, countries, and so on, and how this matter for economic outcome. So which kind of economic activity do we observe in one place but maybe not in other places, and how this interacts with space or geography.
Mm-hmm.
I can go much deeper if you want. So
yeah, that would be interesting if you can say in terms of decisions or what specifically are we looking at?
Yeah, so we have also to think about that probably we as a consumers, any decisions we are doing in terms of which kind of a product we are buying, to which place we go for our summer holidays and so on, that this of course has also a regional component in it. So it's about when we consume products from Czech Republic, economic activity would take place here and not in other places where we are importing things potentially. It has a direct link, obviously, also to infrastructure. So all the connection between spaces, which are the road network, the train network, but also about airports and so on, they are only there, of course, because people and economic agents want to integrate a space in a sense. So we want to trade with other people, we want to go to other places for our holidays and so on. So every action, in a sense, that we are doing is not unrelated to space and geography. So it has a real item what we can observe in places close by, whether economic activity is taking place here or in other places.
Mm-hmm. And another aspect, I guess, that we're usually looking at is who is more successful and who is less successful, right? Who is economically prospering and who is maybe not so great, right? So can you tell us something about the differences in the prosperity across the regions?
For sure. So if you look at the history of what others would call urban economics, economic geography, and so on, the main focus was always to explain why some places are better off compared to other places. So it's mainly about spatial or regional economic inequality. If you look on the landscape of today, it's obvious that if you look within a country, often the capital cities and so on, other places that have much higher salaries, GDP per capita is much bigger there compared to the countryside. This was also true, obviously, in a historical perspective. So the Industrial Revolution, for example, was taking place in urban places, or it goes hand in hand with more and more things that were produced in urban places. If you think about long-run development in industrialization and so on. So there is for sure an inequality, a spatial inequality between urban places, countryside, and this is inequality also and mainly within a country. If you go on a more global dimension, potentially, if you think about how well off places are in in Western Europe compared to the former socialist part of the European continent, then these are huge differences that are still there. And they are still there even after 30, 35 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, this is something that I wanted to ask more about. Your expertise is the combination of history and economics. So can you tell us more about the historical origins of these inequalities?
For sure. I mean, there are many differences in how these origins emerge. So one obvious answer is if you would ask ordinary people on the street, if you would ask political scientists, even if you would ask economists, for instance, how to explain the East-West divide between eastern part of the European continent that was exposed for 40 years or even longer to Soviet dominance in a sense, and how to explain the backwardness in terms of GDP per capita figure, wages that are paid here compared to the West, then most of them would say, yeah, it's that disruption that happens mainly after World War II with the planning economy, with people behaving in another way than optimally in a market-based economy, for instance. And these shocks or this history that have been there for 40 years is still visible in present-day figures. So if you look at the GDP level in Poland and compare it to Germany, there's a huge differences still today. But maybe a more pronounced example would be Eastern Germany. So the part that was the part of Germany that was under a socialist hemisphere in a sense. That then was unified with a Western Germany that was a democratic place, a market-based economy. But even in a case where you have the same legal system, the same country, people speak the same language, you still have these ongoing differences in GDP per capita, in the salaries between East and Western part of Germany. And the conventional wisdom is as simple about that all the things happened after World War II until to the fall of the Iron Curtain is because of this disruptions of economic agents and people. They are not prepared in a sense to interact in a marketplace economy. But if you want to allow me that I have also a working paper that is hopefully soon to be published, where I tell a partial different story on that. It's mainly focusing on whether things that happened during the last months of World War II or things that immediately happened after the end of World War II, whether this matters for a long-run economic activity of some parts of Europe, but not to others.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I think is exactly the next thing we should talk about, because the paper is about the very short presence, right, of the Red Army in a specific part of Austria. So can you tell us more about the paper?
Yes. So indeed. So what I'm looking there is mainly the aim to look about whether we have a particular setting that is provided, in my case, by historical circumstances, to see whether the arrival of the Red Army compared to the arrival of the troops from the United States, for instance, whether this matters for a subsequent regional economic development. And what I'm looking at here is on southern part of Austria, where it was a region that was at the end of World War II, so at the day of the ceasefire agreement between Nazi Germany and the Western Allies, in a sense, was still under Nazi German control. And then within less than 24 hours, the Red Army from the east, but also the Western Allies from the south, which were the troops from the United Kingdom and the troops from the United States, they want to seize this large part of Austria that was somewhat still under Nazi German control. And at the place where the respective armies met, this became then the line of contact that only was there for around 2.5 months. So it means that some places in southern Austria were quasi-exogenously exposed to be seized by the Red Army, with some bad treatments regarding lootings, for instance, but also violence against civilians. And other parts, just the neighboring municipalities, were the happy ones, where they were the last reaching places where the forces from the United Kingdom or the United States were showing up. So I'm in particular focusing on this line of contact after World War II. As I said, this was in place for only 2.5 months. Mm-hmm. And then I look about what's going on in terms of regional economic activity in those places exposed to the Red Army for 2.5 months compared to those that were the happy ones that were reached by US or a British.
What are the indicators that you're looking at in terms of prosperity, or what do you compare, and what is the duration that you're looking at afterwards?
So in particular, I look until the year 2011, which are the data that are the most recent one in terms of the unit of analysis because of large municipality mergers and so on after. So I look probably on the entire 60 years after World War II, and I'm looking on whether a short episode of violence behavior of one army, but not of another, is really matter for maybe 10 years, 20 years, or maybe even for 70 years. Mm-hmm. And what I find is that if I link this liberation treatment to subsequent figures of regional economic activity, this still matters until today. And I look in particular on population figures, so which places are more prosperous in terms of whether they grow in a population, as a good approximation for a regional economic activity. And I also look on other measures like the capital stock, like measures of labor productivity in the year 2011.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you find?
I find amazing results, I would say, that are quite astonishing, that things are still unequal, even if you look there today in terms of the past population evolution, but also in terms of local tax figures that I use as a proxy for local labor productivity. So if I may explain a little bit more in detail here. Mm-hmm. So obviously, as I told before, so the Red Army was seizing parts of southern Austria. Other armies arrived in other parts. And then I just look what happened across the line of contact there. And initially, there was a relative decline of people that used to live in the parts that were seized by the Red Army. So this decline of population from the last figure before World War II to the first food voucher data I have to say how many people are living in a certain place is around minus 12%. So it means that the population relatively decreases in places close to the line of contact if these places have been seized by the Red Army by around 12%. The surprising fact is that this initial drop of 12% of people amplifies up to 25% in the year 2011.
And what is your explanation for that?
My explanation is simple story about who was leaving those parts historically that were seized by the Red Army. And if you look at the data after digitizing tons of archival data and so on, I can tell a clear story about if there is a violence in some part of a country, then in particular younger people, working age people with their children will escape from those places. And this means that regions exposed to a conflict get older because young people are moving away from those places, but the other ones get much younger because young people, families, children are coming in, and the children that escaped parts that were seized by the Red Army are the parents of the years after. So it means if you look at fertility differences in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and even in the 1970s, so in a sense 10, 20 or 30 years after the Red Army has left this part of Austria, fertility differences are still there 30 years after the Red Army have withdrawn, simply because the children of today, the children of the refugees, will be the parents of the new generation 20 years after. And it means that this initial shock of 12% of population amplifies up to 20%, mainly because of fertility and death rate differentials.
Do you see where these people left?
Anecdotally, I can tell a story of that. Based on the data, I do not observe a municipality to municipality a migration statistic or something like this. But the overall view is about that everything in Eastern Austria that was captured by the Red Army at the end of World War II and in the last day or in the first day after the ceasefire agreement, this was the place where a mass exodus is taking place. And be also aware that part of Austria also became a Soviet occupation zone for more than 10 years. Part of the people that were moving to the west, so to places that were liberated and then occupied permanently by the Western forces, people mainly from eastern part moved to those western parts. So I can give you some example. For example, the capital city of Austria, which is Vienna, shrinks by around 200,000 inhabitants because of this escaping from the Red Army. And those people mainly stay in Austria, but they move to the west. And what I find is that they move to the west independent whether the Red Army would there only be for 2.5 months, as in my example, independent whether they would stay for 10 years, as in the case of the Soviet occupation zone in post-World War II Austria, which leads also to the claim that I can somewhat say that people that escaped the arrival of the Red Army would never return, independent whether the Red Army would have withdrawn, let's say, from Eastern Germany and so on. And this gives an explanation of part of the story, while maybe Eastern Europe is still lacking behind Western parts, simply because what's happened in 1944 is that the exodus took place from east to the west. If I take my story on South Austria, as a blueprint for that, I can also claim that people that left the arrival of the Red Army are younger and more fertile, and this will then boost economic activity mainly in Western Europe, but not in Eastern Europe. So this is a story of Germany potentially. So it's not only the Soviet dominance planning economy for 40 years, it's also about who has left right after the war.
The migration. Well, now this is history, but we have a very, very present war, right? Somewhat next door. So, are you able to draw some parallels for the wars and the war we have in Ukraine now? Many migrants are leaving Ukraine and settling here, right? So
this is the aim. So this is the aim because I want to understand what's going on, basically based on historical experiences, but the aim is also to understand whether we can use these findings researchers are producing, in a sense, whether they can be used also to answer present-day questions, for instance. So this is my personal aim, but of course it's also the aim of any journal that want to have a link between what we learn in the situation after World War II, whether we have similarities in occurrences right today. And if you think about Ukraine, the parallels are clear and straightforward, I would say. So if you look at the refugees 1 year ago or 1.5 years ago, it was obvious to everyone that there were more women escaping at a war zone, mainly from eastern Ukraine, and also there are children. And if you think about the story, and this is likely still today, not all the refugees from Ukraine will return to their home country, even if it would be a peaceful place in hopefully a short period of time, but maybe in 3 or 4 years and so on. So not all of them will return. So it means the children that escaped the Russians in eastern Ukraine, part of them will stay in the Czech Republic, in other parts of Western countries, but also in the western part of Ukraine. And these are the parents of the children that will be born in 10 or 20 years. So probably what I find with the story after World War II has explanation power for how we can expect regional economic differences in Ukraine in the future, which means in 20 or 30 years. It's likely that those regions exposed to the war, you will see that in terms of how densely populated they will be in 20 or even in 50 years. This will still be visible. And it's mainly because the productive young cohorts are leaving, and this will then lead to these amplifying effects in a sense.
Mm-hmm. So now we are planting the seeds for future inequality. Can you, from your research, from the historical perspective, tell us more about what are the ways to actually boost the prosperity in the country? Is there something we can do once, hopefully, the war is over, once soon the war is over? Are there things we can do? What is history telling us that is working for prosperity, except for migration?
This is probably the most important question here. The literature, I would say, mainly focus on, let's say, hard facts like infrastructure, road network, subsidies to invest into the capital stock and so on. So there are much evidence also for Eastern Germany that these do not matter so much, and in particular do not matter so much to attract people to come back. So we need a better policy potentially based on my study in South Austria, based on my impression about how to think about Ukraine or Western versus Eastern Ukraine, is about how to manage that people go back once it will be a peaceful part. And this is a challenge. So there are some studies in the back, and there are overview books about where scholars in the field of economic geography has discussing how to rebuild a prosperous Ukraine, for instance. And I counted this book or this a compendium about different articles there. There were probably 9 or 10. Only one of those 10 studies were focusing on people and saying we should do some particular housing policies and subsidies, not for firms, that then is argued that they will pull the people to these places, but we should give some a push or pull factors that people have incentives by themselves to go there and start economic activity there. So like housing subsidies and so on. But if you look on economists, I would say the majority thinks about that subsidies to build up roads, bridges, infrastructure, a beton in a sense is what you should do. But I would say people matters much more. So how to make incentives to bring them back. Implicitly, if I can say that, the idea of building up better infrastructure is also aimed to be a pull factor to bring the people back. But if you see the infrastructure in Eastern Germany and how many people went there where the infrastructure was improved enormously, and if you look at the quality of the infrastructure in Eastern Germany compared to Western Germany, the infrastructure in Eastern Germany is of a much higher quality, simply because everything is built up from a scratch 20 years ago. But this did not lead to a major wave of remigration from west to the east. If anything, out-migration from eastern Germany, the former GDR, is still ongoing, and in particular of younger cohorts and better educated cohorts. So you have to build up, let's say, a vibrant society where young, innovative people are there in a place and then they build up something. And it should not be promoted that some state authorities, the European Union, will build up something in the hope that people then come back. I think history of Eastern Germany does not tell the story that infrastructure is the way to bring people back.
I wanted to ask you about the role of technology, because exactly as the economists think, okay, if we do infrastructure, if we do, if we prepare the place so that it will be functional, then people will come and use the opportunity. You're claiming it's not working like that, but you have a research in which is also looking at the regional economic inequality and the role of technology in there, right? Can you briefly maybe speak about that?
Yes, thanks. So this is a great point that you come back to this new paper in a sense. So results are quite in a preliminary stage there. But indeed, so what is one extension to the paper or the idea we have discussed before, so that conflict causes decline in population, and then we look about whether this matter for the long run. We can also think about new technologies that maybe shapes regional economic activity. One example is over COVID, for instance, that there was a discussion when now people can work from home, maybe people will spread more equally across the countryside. This is based on the observation, obviously, that the rent prices in Prague, for instance, are bumped. They are growing enormously,
yes.
Mainly because people from the countryside want to live in urban places because here are the good jobs. And then over COVID and over the Zoom revolution, in a sense, people, politicians, supporter of regional convergence were saying, now this is our chance to bring people back to the countryside. So it's a story. We look in history, of course, so we don't look on the COVID revolution and or the Zoom revolution.
You'll do in 10 years though.
Potentially, I don't know whether history is over in 10 years, but this is a lovely thing about that. Maybe this topic becomes interesting for me if I'm retired. I don't know, because then it's a long time back. Yeah. So the question is importance and really about whether new technology, which kind of technology ever, can lead to regional convergence, so that regions move closer together in terms of their economic activity, or whether they move apart from each other. COVID and Zoom was only the argument mainly, now people spread equally or more equally across the country. In fact, we do not observe that.
Yeah,
so city centers are still the place for young people and young families to be. This was not the case. If you go to Western Europe, in particular, 30, 40 years ago, if you were a young father, then you aimed to go to the countryside. So this was more a spread of where people live and also spread of economic activity. But nowadays, since the last 10 or 15 years, people, more productive, better educated people, younger people, are gathering more and more in a few places only, leading to dispersion between the countryside and, of course, the cities. And this is not only a regional dispersion, it's also a political dispersion. So people that are more conservative, that are older, that maybe vote for some conservative parties, they live on the countryside, and those that more a left wing maybe or a progressive, they live in cities. So
yeah, we just saw that on the Slovak elections.
Obviously, but it's the same in the Czech Republic,
Yes.
it's the same in Germany. So there is a divide, an increasing cleavage between prosperous urban places and the countryside, not only in economic terms, but at the end also in political terms. And this may be unhealthy for finding a compromise and understand each other.
So are you arguing that technology is actually not making the difference?
At least if I would propagate my study that I do in Switzerland, where I look on one particular technology that was not available for a long period of time and then becomes available in some part of the country, I would say that access to some technology would even amplify or increase initial differences.
Okay. What technology are you looking at?
I look on a fancy one, maybe a lot of people are caring about, and these are automobiles.
Okay.
So if I can explain in a little bit more detail, so it's about that one canton of Switzerland introduced the automobile ban for 25 years. So this was in the early period of automobiles until the year 1925, where automobiles were a common feature mainly for the better off people, but it was not a phenomena like it is today. But independent of that, I mean, those part of Switzerland that imposed this automobile ban until 1925, people, entrepreneurs, the lodging industry, hotels, they wanted automobiles can also enter the borders of this particular place. So there was huge debate whether the ban should be ended or not, and then it was ended in 1925. And the idea of automobiles is obvious. It connects places better with each other. And if you think about automobiles or Zoom, the arguments are the same. The argument was, with automobiles, people in remote places have better chances to do economic activity, or the rich tourists from outside will now also come to very remote places where before that they only go to the hotspot of economic or touristic activity. What we find, if you look at the openings and the closure of firms based on commercial registers, is about that we observe a boom in economic activity in terms of foundation of firms right after the end of the boom, so in 1925, in 1926, and this boom mainly takes place in very small places and very remote places. So this is what people would think of. Those places that arguably should benefit the most from a new technology are really start to boom right after this technology became available. But if you look at 10 years after, most of these newly founded firms in remote places get bankrupt and do not exist anymore for a long period of time. Which means in the remote, badly connected places before, without this technology, there is only a kind of expectation that the future will also come to those places, and then there starts a boom period, but this is followed by a bust period. And if anything, in the long run, we observe that the automobile boom starting in better connected places, that starts some 3 years after the end of the automobile ban, this boom in the better connected, better off places is more sustainable. So at the end, it's not a convergence story. It's only about that there was a fire going on, a boom and bust period in the remote places. But at the end, those that have been strong before are those that also more sustainably profit from the access to this new technology.
So that prosperity is a really long-term thing, and just changing one thing does not change the overall outcome, right?
Generally, yes, of course. I mean, there are studies, an example where this kind of policy has long-run consequences, and that you can change something with political measures or policies. But as a combination of all the papers I know, of all the studies I'm doing with archival data and so on, it's really about people matters for prosperity, for economic activity. And if you do not reshuffle where people used to live, where they start economic activity, where they build a family, inequalities in regional space will be persistent. So a technology per se does not change anything as long as people do not reallocate. And this was not the case in this historical setting where we look on Switzerland. And of course, you can change regional economic activity if an ugly, forceful army is showing up and then part of the population is replaced. Then you have real impact. But in building this bridge there or not does not matter so much, or having this technology or not does also not matter so much.
Christian, I think these are excellent concluding words. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for your insights.
Yeah, thanks for the interview.